Okay. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Judy Heron, and I am the City Clerk for the City of Menlo Park. And on behalf of the Menlo Park City Council, City Manager, and City staff, we want to thank you for your dedication to serve on a Menlo Park advisory body. As a City Council appointed citizen member, you are considered a public official serving in an advisory capacity to the City Council, performing a valuable service by addressing the needs of your community. The City Council is looking forward to your contribution as we work together to provide efficient municipal service that is responsive to local needs and expectations. We appreciate your willingness to work in this capacity and hope that your experience is stimulating, enjoyable, and satisfying. Staff is going to present a 60-minute video, which will cover both ethics and open government training. This is an annual requirement of all advisory body members. This video will also be posted online, and a link will be sent to all advisory body members. Following this training video, our Assistant City Attorney, Tamar Burke, will be available to answer any questions. As always, I'm available to assist and field any questions you may have throughout your term. I can be reached via email at jaheron@menlopark.org or by phone at 650-330-6620, or you can find other great information on our website, menlopark.org/cityclerk. I would also like to give a huge thanks to our Administrative Assistant, Sarah Sandoval, and Executive Assistant to the City Manager, Nicole Casados, for their crucial role in organizing this training. Thank you both. And with that, I will ask Sarah to begin the training video.
Here is my cautionary tale of what happens to folks who don't do this excellent training. This is from a few years ago now. The city of Beaumont, a bunch of officials from there got into some pretty serious trouble for violating a whole slew of the rules that we're about to go through. There were several $1 million of misappropriated funds. These folks are actually, I think, are still in prison for this. So just a cautionary tale, more on this corruption business. Okay, so the agenda for this presentation, we'll quickly go through transparency laws. That's the Brown Act and the California Public Records Act. We will also go over personal financial interests and fair processes. This is mostly conflicts issues. And then we will also quickly touch on, I sort of think of this last one as miscellaneous, personal advantages and perks of office, rules surrounding sort of what it is entailed by holding public office. So first we'll have our transparency laws. As I mentioned earlier, we have two main sources, the Brown Act and the Public Records Act, and we're going to go over them in that order. And I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking. Someone just walked past the front door. So we'll start with the Brown Act. So the Brown Act basically is just our open meetings law. All meetings of legislative bodies of a local agency must be open and public. And moreover, all persons must be permitted to attend any meeting. And there are a lot of rules around the Brown Act and how everyone needs to behave and communications. And so it's helpful for me to think about the main reason that the Brown Act exists. And it's basically just here to ensure that the government is not, making shady closed door deals, is making all of its decisions in front of people so that the public can see how these decisions are being made and what decisions are being made. And I think if you think about the Brown Act in that, through that lens, it makes the rules and all the exceptions and all of that business a little bit easier to follow. So as I said, the basic rule is that all meetings of boards, commissions, city council are covered by the Brown Act. And because this is a legal theory, all of these words have specific meanings and different definitions. So a meeting under the Brown Act is defined as any gathering of a majority of the members of a legislative body at the same time and location to hear, discuss, deliberate, or take action upon any item that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of that body. And here's where I would pause for questions. So if anyone has questions about this, I should have said this at the top. If anyone has questions about any of the things that I go over today, please feel free to send an email to our office. We are more than happy to assist with Brown Act, Public Records Act, or conflicts questions. These things are all a little bit confusing. So we are always available to field any questions. So the Brown Act applies to all formal meetings. That includes regular meetings, special meetings, and emergency meetings. And if there are formal meetings, then it follows that there are also informal meetings, and those are improper under the Brown Act. So an informal meeting is when a majority of the members of the legislative body use a series of communications of any kind, either directly or through intermediaries, to discuss, deliberate, or take action on items that are within the body's subject matter jurisdiction. And the idea behind this is, again, if you're using this series of communications outside of a meeting, a public meeting, then the public the opportunity to view the decision-making process and to participate in the decision-making process. So that's why the Brown Act sort of prohibits this kind of communication. And there are sort of two main ways that we see this informal serial meeting happen. The first is called a daisy chain, and perhaps as the name suggests, this happens when member A contacts member B, who contacts member C, and so on until a quorum of the body has discussed or made a decision outside of a closed or outside of a public meeting. So obviously this is in violation of the Brown Act, and we need to treat our communications with other board members and council members and commissioners with some caution, because again, you don't really know who's going to say what to who. So the second type of improper serial meeting is called a hub and spoke meeting. And this is sort of similar to the daisy chain, where instead of having, the kind of like telephone where it goes down the line, you have one person who acts as the intermediary, who contacts a quorum of the public body and is able to then sort of spread an opinion or obtain a consensus on an item. So this would be, and the hub can be a member of staff, it can be a council member, it can be even a member of the public. And so this is a specific reason why in speaking with really anyone, we need to be a little careful about what we say, because we can't control what other people do with the information that we give them. The place we see improper meetings happening most often now is in technology. We most often see it in email, texting, and social media. The use of any of this tech by a majority of the body to discuss, deliberate, or take action on items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the body still is considered a violation of the Brown Act. So we do have some recommendations for email, and I definitely recommend at least trying to comply with these. It'll make your life and our lives much easier. So the first is just to avoid sending emails to the whole body. Sometimes you have to, and when that's the case, try to limit the discussion to really only information. So, hey, everyone, meeting's at 6 at City Hall. That's fine. But hey, everyone, the meeting's at 6. What do you think about agenda item 4? That might, that goes a little too far and would kind of solicits a response from more folks. Following up onto that, be careful when you're replying to emails. So do try not to communicate your position on any matters or make any commitments on anything that could come before the body, because you don't know what could happen to that email or who it could get sent to. And we don't want to have an accidental serial meeting on our hands. And as much as you can, please remember not to directly reply to a majority of your board or your commission if you're going to communicate with them over email. And of course, think carefully before sending any email. This sort of bleeds into the Public Records Act as well. But remember, your email can be forwarded by others to a majority of the board. And as a rule of thumb, if you wouldn't want to see what you wrote in an email in the front page maybe just pick up the phone and don't put it in an email. All right, so despite all of my warnings about serial meetings, individual meetings are okay. City employees or officials may meet with individuals to discuss items on the agenda or anything else outside of a meeting, to answer questions or provide information, but you do need to remember that to not communicate your position to the person that you're talking to or to any other members of the body, because again, it's very easy to fall into the trap of a serial meeting. For example, if you sit on a planning commission and one of the applicants wants to take you out to the job site, that is totally acceptable. But if you're out there and you say, oh, I love this project, I'm definitely going to vote yes on it because of all of these great things, there's nothing really to stop the applicant from then telling someone else on the planning commission, oh, I spoke to planning commissioner A and they love the project because of X and Y and Z. And it's a slippery slope from there to an improper Brown Act violation. So please do be careful when you're speaking with individuals outside of a meeting. The Brown Act also requires that boards and commissions and bodies really only discuss items that appear on the agenda. And the reason for this is that we want to make sure that the public knows what will be discussed during the meeting so that they can choose to participate or not participate, just to give the public a heads up of what sort of decisions are going to be taking place at each meeting. So it follows that action or discussion on items not appearing on the posted agenda is generally prohibited. Board members may only, to the extent that you are going to talk about things that are not on the agenda, you can really only briefly respond to public statements or questions, ask questions for clarification, make brief announcements, briefly report on activities that are relevant to the board or commission that you're on, provide references to staff or other sources of factual information. And you, of course, if something is really pressing, you may request that staff place that item on a future agenda so that the board or commission can have a more robust discussion about it. Excuse me. Okay. The Brown Act also encourages public participation in a variety of ways. It requires that public meetings take place in ADA accessible locations. It provides that the city must make agendas available to the public at least when they are all distributed to a majority of the body. The public has to be allowed to speak on an agenda item before or during the body's consideration of the item. And the public is allowed to record meetings. So this whole time we've been talking about meetings and how they have to be open for the public to participate and sort of view the decision-making process. There is a narrow exception where boards and commissions and the council may meet in closed session. And this just means that the public is not able to attend, and it's really only the council, or more likely the planning commission or the council. It's pretty unlikely that an advisory board would meet in a closed session, but it's when these bodies meet behind closed doors to discuss sort of sensitive topics. And the Brown Act authorizes a very short list of topics under which bodies can go into closed session. And so the most common ones are to discuss either existing or potential litigation, real estate negotiations, personnel matters, and labor negotiations. And the idea behind a closed session sort of makes sense. You don't want a public agency to give up their, attorney-client privilege or their negotiating position just because, the Brown Act requires them to make decisions in open session. So there are these narrow exceptions wherein bodies may meet in closed session to discuss these sensitive topics without the public's input or viewing, I suppose. The sort of neat thing about closed sessions is that all of the information that is discussed in closed session is completely confidential. And in many cases, even a court wouldn't be able to kind of access those records or those minutes. So what happens if someone thinks the city has violated the Brown Act? So the Brown Act is actually pretty cool for cities. It gives us a second bite at the apple, so to speak. So if someone thinks that the city has violated the Brown Act, before they sue us, sorry, I had to cut. My dog was doing weird things. Okay, is everything cool over there, Penny? Okay. Okay, I'm gonna start back up again. So before anyone can sue the city for a Brown Act violation, they must send the city a letter. We call it a cure and correct letter saying, hey, city, we think you violated the Brown Act. Here's why. You know, are you going to fix it, basically? And so then that letter will come to the city attorney's office. We'll take a look at it. We'll review all the facts, and one of two things will happen. We'll either say, nope, I don't think we did violate the Brown Act. I think we did everything right. And, you know, we're not going to do anything to correct this action. If that's our answer, then the person has the choice then to sue the city, claiming that we violated the Brown Act. We'll litigate it, and that'll be that. If we look at the letter and we say, ooh, yep, it looks like we may have, you know, accidentally posted the agenda too late, or, you know, whatever many ways that it's that a city can violate the Brown Act, it's not a huge deal. We can just nullify the action that was taken in violation of the Brown Act, and then have another meeting and comply with the Brown Act and take that action again then. So if we do end up litigating and we lose, it's kind of a bummer. We have to pay the other side's court costs and attorney's fees, which can be pretty pricey. More since you've now had this excellent training, but folks who intentionally violate the Brown Act are guilty of a misdemeanor. So that's a little scary. But now that you have taken this training and you know all the ins and outs of the Brown Act, you certainly won't knowingly violate it. And I think that is it for the Brown Act. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to shoot an email to our city attorney or to myself, and we will be happy to answer any of your questions. All right, on to the next topic under transparency laws. We have the Public Records Act, or the PRA. This just ensures that the public has access to all of the government's records. So the rule is that all of the city's public records must be disclosed to the public upon request, unless there's a specific reason not to do so. And one court described it as islands of privacy floating in a sea of disclosure. So the baseline rule is, if the city has it and someone asks for it, we need to give it to them, unless it fits into one of these enumerated exceptions, which our office handles, and then we won't produce it. So a public record is any writing containing information relating to the conduct of the people's business, prepared, owned, used, or retained by any state or local agency, regardless of physical form or characteristic. It is extremely broad, pretty much covers almost everything the city has. You know, emails about like, hey, can we grab lunch at 1? That's probably not a public record, unless it's, hey, can we grab a lunch at 1? I'd like to talk about X and Y and Z things that we discussed in the meeting this morning. That probably is a public record. So it's really, really broad. And in 2017, it became even broader. So in 2017, the California Supreme Court held that information related to the public's business that was retained on private cell phones or in a private email account is nonetheless considered a public record and subject to disclosure under the Public Records Act. It makes sense, because if this wasn't the rule, then everyone could just open up their own private email account, and those emails technically wouldn't be subject to the PRA. So it does make sense. However, it does create a little bit of logistical trouble in collecting these records from city officials and staff. And so I'll actually go through that now. Generally, the life cycle of a PRA, I like to go through this just because it's helpful for you folks to know what we do, so that when you get the email asking for records, you sort of know what's happening and why we're doing this. So generally, someone will send in a request for records. If the request is for communications, emails, text messages, voicemails, etc., you'll get an email from me or someone from my office saying, hello, we received this Public Records Act request seeking all records related to whatever, Project X. Please, search your personal cell phone, social media, email accounts for records relating to Project X and send them over to us. You'll do that. If you don't have any, all the better. Just say you don't have any. If you do, also fine. You'll just send them over to us. We will review them for privilege or any other appropriate exemption, and then we'll either produce them or not. So to assist you in figuring out which records to keep and which records not to keep, I always suggest people take a look at the retention schedule. This is just the city's document that says, these are all of the records that we have, and here is the minimum amount of time that we need to keep them for. And so long as the city has a record, then we are obligated to produce it, even if the retention schedule says that it could have been deleted after 2 years of use. Even if the record is 20 years old and we still have it, it's responsive and we need to produce it. So that's it on the PRA. One more thing I like to note is for commissions and boards that do not have city issued email addresses. I recommend that you either create an entirely new email account specifically for city business, or throw all of your city related emails into a folder in your personal account so that it's easy for you to find the records that we're looking for when we send you a request to search for records responsive to PRAs. All right, so that's it with the PRA. I'm going to now move into our second topic on the agenda, which is personal financial interests and fair processes. These are just the conflicts laws, and we'll go through those. So there's three sources of conflict of interest rules. The first is the Political Reform Act. The second is contractual conflicts under Government Code Section 1090. And the last is common law ethics. This is sort of a catch-all. It's not in any statute, so this is just sort of based off of hundreds of years of cases. So much like the Brown Act, conflicts rules are extremely confusing, very nuanced, a lot of exceptions to exceptions. So it's helpful to sort of think about the purpose of these rules in guiding your analysis and in guiding sort of a quick overview of these conflicts rules. So they really just exist to make sure that the government is acting in the best interests of the people that it governs and not the people that sit on the governing bodies. And the three sources of conflicts rules that I just discussed all cover different aspects of that same idea. We need to make sure that the government is actually working for the people rather than the people that are sitting in the behind the levers of government. So I'm gonna say off the top, this is not intended to make you all experts in the conflicts rules. It's really only just to make sure that you're able to identify potential issues so that then you can bring your questions to our office and we can do the analysis and give you our best suggestion. So recognizing potential conflicts as early as possible is essential. And the earlier you're able to identify potential conflicts and bring those to our office, the better. It's way easier to consider a conflicts issue, a week, 2 weeks in advance, rather than, oh, hi, I participated in a meeting yesterday and I'm not sure whether I had a conflict. Can you please take a look at this? Those are very stressful and not my favorite type of email to receive. So even if you're not totally sure that it's a conflict, or you're like, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, we would rather get an email saying, hi, I'm not sure about this. Can you take a look? And for us to say, oh no, this isn't a conflict, you're fine, than to not know about it at all and then have to figure out how to deal with a potentially conflicted decision maker. So I'm not entirely sure that most of you have this requirement, but I'll run through it anyways. Some public officials are subject to this Form 700 requirement. It's basically just a disclosure of financial interests to make sure that your financial interests as a decision maker are public, and so that the people know, okay, this person has some sort of something to gain or lose by decisions affecting whatever Visa, if you or your spouse works for Visa, or whatever the case may be. And so again, since this is for mostly advisory bodies, this may not apply, but in case you move into other areas where these would apply, here's a brief primer. So again, a little bit more on the disclosure. Designated officials are required to fill it out. You're required to disclose interest in real property, business positions, sources of incomes, gifts. You'd file it with the city, who then files it with the FPPC, which is the Fair Political Practices Commission, and they're the folks that are responsible for enforcing all these conflicts rules. Here's a cautionary tale of someone who did not fill in their disclosure. The FPPC found out, and they fined him $200. So here are the conflicts of interest rules under the Political Reform Act. This is the first kind of big bucket of conflicts laws. So the general rule is that a public official may not make, participate, or influence a governmental decision that will have a foreseeable and material financial effect on the official's economic interests. And since this is a legal theory, again, each of these prongs has a whole bunch of analysis and regulations that interpret it. And that's what we're here for, is to analyze that with facts that you folks provide. So when we look at these issues, there are several potential economic interests that we'll look for to determine whether or not you're conflicted out of a decision. The first is your source of income, and this is defined as any source of income of $500 or more during the prior 12 months for you or your spouse or domestic partner. So if you, for example, work at a restaurant and this restaurant is seeking a permit from the city for some reason, and you sit on the body that is going to hear the permit, you may be conflicted as by virtue of your the fact that the restaurant is considered a source of income for you. So here's another example. This person was a member of a board of directors of a hospital district. He violated these conflict rules when he voted in favor of a contract which benefited a client of his own business. So again, we've got this source of income implicated, and he should not have participated where the governmental decision could have created some sort of financial incentive for him. Another economic interest we'll look at in determining whether you have a conflict is any interest in business management, employment, or an investment. So if you're participating in a decision where a business entity in which you're an official, a director, officer, partner, or even an employee is implicated, you may have a conflict that we'd want to review. Same thing for a decision implicating a business in which you have a direct or indirect investment of $2,000 or more. Here's another example of this economic interest being implicated. This guy was an assistant city manager and the controller. He violated this rule when he failed to disclose his interest in an Orange Julius franchise that was located in a shopping mall, and he participated in decisions relating to the expansion of that shopping mall. And the FPPC really hated this one and fined him $18,000. So the next economic interest that we would look for in evaluating conflicts is any interest in real property. And this one is kind of the big one, comes up pretty often. Real property is defined as any real property interest worth $2,000 or more. And in some instances, it could also include an interest in a lease. So even if you're just renting a place, we'd want to know so that we can run through the analysis, because there are instances where that could create a conflict. The big kind of baseline rule for real property conflicts is that you are automatically conflicted out, unless some exemption applies, of any decision that may affect the land use or value of the property that you own if the decision is within 500 feet of your property. So if you live in a house and across the street from the house is a park, and the city is voting, or you're voting on some whatever, park expansion, beautification project, whatever, you'd probably be conflicted out of it because that project, the park project, is within 500 feet of your home. So here is an example. This council member violated these rules when he voted to obtain a state grant, which would extend water and sewer lines to an area of the city where he owned real property and operated an inn and restaurant. And I should point out here that just because you have one economic interest doesn't mean that you can't have more. So in this instance, we had the real property economic interest, we had probably the business interest, and we had the source of income interest, excuse me. The FPPC fined him $4,000 for that mistake. So here are two exceptions. And this just means that if you bring us a set of facts and you say, oh, I'm not sure, we run through it and we say, oh yeah, I think you might be conflicted out. There are these two last ditch sort of ways that you might not be conflicted out. So the first is the public generally exception, and the second is called the legally required participation exception. They're both pretty narrow. So the public generally exception applies to decisions that affect a broad range of persons or interests. And this is defined as 25% of all businesses, 25% of all real property, or 25% of all individuals. I like to think of this one as like the taxes exemption. If this exception didn't exist, then no city would ever be able to pass taxes because they would affect everyone and they would be conflicted out. So that's kind of how I think about this exception. The second exception, the legally required participation exception, could apply if a conflict disqualifies so many officials that there's no longer a quorum to make a decision. This one's kind of fun. If this is the case, then the way that we decide who's going to be the person to create the quorum, I think it's like drawing straws or flipping a coin or something random like that, which is fun. You don't really get something like that in the law very often. This exception, though, is super limited. It does not apply if a quorum could later be met or if it's just to break a tie vote. So this just means that, if someone's absent and that person is not conflicted, but without that person, there's no quorum, we just wait for that person to come back. Same with the tie vote. So that's it on the Political Reform Act. We'll get into what happens if you need to recuse or if you are conflicted and the violations of these things a little bit later on. So the second big bucket of conflicts laws is contractual conflicts, and you might hear them referred to as 1090 conflicts. That's just because they're in Government Code Section 1090. This is a prohibition on self-dealing, and it really will only ever come up in contracts. If the city or the body that you're sitting on is reviewing or accepting or adopting a contract, then we think about 1090. But if not, then 1090 is not going to be implicated. So it's pretty narrow, but still worth discussing. So Section 1090 prohibits officials and employees from having financial interests in contracts made by them in their official capacities or any board of which they are members. It's pretty broad. So the term contract is also very, very broadly construed. For example, a grant is considered a contract. Financial gain isn't even required for you to be conflicted if you have some sort of interest in the outcome of the contract. There are some exceptions to this. If the contract existed before you assumed office, then the city can still enter into or can still be a part of the contract, so long as no modifications to that contract are made during your tenure in office. The other exception is if your interest in the contract is terminated prior to your participation in making the contract as a public official. So here's the basic rule for contractual conflicts. If the public official or employee has a financial interest in the contract, the contract is entirely prohibited regardless of whether the official participates in or abstains from the actual decision. This is a little different than under the Political Reform Act, and I can get into that a little bit later. So Under the contractual conflicts of interest provisions, there are also some exceptions, of course. And because the 1090 provisions are so broad and the baseline rule is you cannot participate, nor can the city participate if you have an interest, these two exceptions are kind of broad. So remote interests and non-interests. If you're, if we look at the facts and we see that your financial interest is pretty remote, and there's a list of what this means under 1091, then the city can enter into the decision, but you cannot participate. Same goes for non-interests. If your financial interest is deemed a non-interest under 1091.5, then you may not participate, but the city can. Violations of 1090 are pretty steep, and that's why it's very important if there's a contract before your body and you think you might have a conflict, please let us know as soon as possible so we can give you our best advice. So if a contract is made in violation of section 1090, the contract is actually deemed void, which means all money paid under the contract has to be returned. And so, as I'm sure you can imagine, the parties that we contract with are not too happy with the city if we violated section 1090. And moreover, willful violations may be punished by a fine, imprisonment, and disqualification from public office. So there's a lot at stake here with 1090. It's kind of limited in application, but pretty serious consequences if we get it wrong. So if you ever have a question on contract stuff, please do let us know. We'll be happy to take a look. So that's it on government code section 1090. I'm going to move on now into our common law conflicts. I sort of think of this as, if it's not a conflict under the Political Reform Act and it's not a conflict under 1090, there's no contract involved or something like that, but it still feels a little weird, still feels a little icky, it might be a common law conflict. So this one is more directed toward personal interests or biases. Personal interests or biases, either positive or negative, about the facts or the parties, reasonably may cast doubt on your ability to make a fair decision. And so these common law conflicts rules are really there to make sure that public officials exercise power with at least the appearance of disinterested skill, zeal, and diligence. And I remember the first time I read that second bullet point, and I was like, this doesn't really mean very much. It's very, what does disinterested skill, zeal, and diligence mean? But courts cite that language all of the time. It is very, very important to think about those things when you're, the way you present yourself on the dais or how you make your decisions as a public official. So it's not just lofty legal writing. This is actually what courts look for when they look at this, when they look at these issues. So what happens if you're disqualified under either the Political Reform Act, 1090, or common law conflicts? If you're disqualified, or excuse me, this only applies if you are conflicted under the Political Reform Act or common law biases. 1090, neither, the city cannot participate either. If it's a non-interest or a remote interest under 1090, then the city may participate, and these are the rules that you would follow. So if you're disqualified, you have to identify the applicable interest with specificity, step down from the dais and leave the room unless it's on the consent calendar, and refrain from any discussion or participation. In the time of Zoom, we have been recommending that folks who are disqualified identify their interests with specificity and then just turn off their cameras and mute themselves until the discussion has ended. There is an exception to this. So even if you are disqualified because you have some sort of conflict in the decision, you may still participate as a member of the public from the audience, only on those matters that affect your personal economic interests. So, you know, if the restaurant that you work for is seeking a permit from the city, you can go as an employee of the restaurant and say, this would be really great for me and for the, you know, for the neighborhood, and that'll be that. So there's this other sort of extraneous conflict to keep in mind, conflicts created by future employment. So Officials may not participate in decisions involving a prospective employer. This includes interviews and negotiations. So if you're in the process of interviewing with someone, with a company, and that company comes before your board, you may not participate in that discussion. Moreover, officials and senior management may not represent parties before their former agency for 1 year after leaving office. And this is kind of, just to stop the revolving door between public service and private service, or private for profit. So there are these other fairness and process laws that I am going to quickly mention. Since this is for mostly advisory boards and bodies, this is a little bit less relevant, but just to sort of put this all on your radar, there are due process requirements where a decision could affect somebody's property or liberty interests. There are public bidding requirements in the Public Contract Code, as well as in federal regulations, non-discrimination requirements, of course, and this almost goes without saying, but we have laws about it, so we must say it. Please don't embezzle. It's illegal and it'll get us all in a lot of trouble. So here's the due process stuff. This really only applies where there are vested property or liberty interests. So the Planning Commission and the City Council are really the ones that will more than likely be the ones that are dealing with this, but something to keep in mind. Where there are property or liberty interests implicated, those hearings are subject to the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, which requires proper notice, the right to present your case, and fair and unbiased decision makers. Another conflicts thing, incompatible offices. This is codified at Government Code Section 1099. Basically just says that you can't hold two public offices at the same time if one of these three things are true. One of the offices exercises a supervisory, auditing, or removal power over the other office, or if there's a significant clash of duties or loyalties between the two offices, or if there are public policy considerations that make it improper. So this is kind of like, we don't want you to be your own boss sort of situation. We have a government of checks and balances, and if the same person is doing the checking and the balancing, then it kind of undermines the point. The consequence of holding an incompatible office is just that the person is deemed to have forfeited the first office upon ascending to the second. This doctrine, again, it's kind of narrow. It is inapplicable in a whole bunch of situations. So it's inapplicable where a statute says that it is. It is inapplicable to employment positions, to a government body that only has advisory powers. That's, I think, most of you folks. And where a member of a multi-member body holds an office that may audit, overrule, remove members of, dismiss employees of, or exercise supervisory powers over another office, only when that body has any of these powers over the other office. Oh my goodness, what a mouthful. This probably won't apply to you. All right, that's it for conflicts. Again, it is a very thorny subject. So if you ever have any questions about it, or you're not sure about something, please do not hesitate to bring your questions to our office. We're all very nice, and we will be more than happy to chat with you about what you think might be happening. Okay, and we're into our last big topic here. So personal advantages and perks. These are the legal limitations on official benefits and perks of being a city official. Expense reimbursement. So the general rule is that you may only be reimbursed for actual and necessary expenses. And to be reimbursed, you need to follow the appropriate reporting requirements. And the city has a reimbursement policy. You can reach out to the city manager's office for more information on that. The penalty for following these procedures improperly or attempting to collect reimbursement that's not actual and necessary. Loss of reimbursement privilege, restitution, which means you need to pay the city back, civil penalties, and up to 3 times the value of the misused resources, also maybe jail time, and a ban from public office. And as a reminder, these expense reports are public records, so it's important to make sure that they are accurate and filed timely, because if someone asks for them, we need to provide them. Gifts. Gifts are also a little bit tricky and weird. So a gift is anything of value which you receive for which you do not provide monetary or other consideration of equal or greater value. That's like the most lawyery way of explaining a gift. It could also include, though, discounts and rebates if those discounts and rebates are not also given to the general public. So the thing with gifts is that you need to, if you receive them, you need to report them if they are worth $50 or more per year per source. So if someone gives you a $25 gift card one time in the year, that's okay. But if someone gives you 3 $25 gift cards in the same year, then you need to report that. There's also a limit on the total value of gifts that you can receive. And this year, that limit is $520 per source. Another one that feels like it should go without saying, but we've got laws about it, so we've got to say it. It is a misdemeanor to receive any kind of gratuity or reward for performing one's duties. So please don't take tips for your public service. Honoraria. So this is a general prohibition on receiving payment for speeches or articles at, conferences, events, things like that. There is an exception for this. If you're speaking in or writing an article in connection with your private business, that's fine. It's just, receiving honoraria as a member of, city government. A handy tip, if you do go to a conference or something like that and they give you something, then you can just return it or donate it within 30 days of receipt, and you don't have to report it or do anything about it. All right, the misuse of public resources. So the general rule with this is that the city may not use public funds or resources for personal, non-public purposes, including campaigns. Public resources is pretty broad, and it includes staff time, office equipment, and supplies, but it does exclude, incidental or minimal use. So a staple here and there is probably not a big deal, but if you print out 700 campaign flyers, you might be in a little bit of trouble. Penalties for violating this rule include disqualification from public office, jail, civil penalties up to $1,000 a day, plus 3 times the value of the unlawful use. Not fun. This was a cool one not cool, but an unusual one, I suppose. Top fire official was suspected of driving the county vehicle while collecting his $1,000 a month personal car allowance. This is a classic case of misuse of public resources, where the fire chief was driving around the county's car while also taking money for his own car. The mass mailing prohibition, this one always causes a little bit more fright than I think is necessary, but I'll make sure to sort of clear that up. The rule for this is that no newsletter or other mass mailing may be sent at the public's expense. And the purpose of this rule is simply to conserve resources, city resources, and to make sure that public funds aren't being used to give any incumbents an advantage. And if you think about it in that lens, it makes this prohibition a little bit less scary. So it only applies where the city is sending out 200 or more items per month and an official is featured. And I have an example on the next slide to show you what that means. So penalties, though, for violating this include criminal liability and restitution. That just means paying the city back for the cost of whatever you did. So here's an example of where public officials were featured in a mass mailer that violated that rule. So the FPPC fined the city of Rockland $2,000 for sending out this newsletter wherein the city council was identified with pictures and name, and that was seen as sort of an improper use of public money to further these incumbents' campaigns. So another thing to keep in mind is that local agencies are prohibited from making gifts of public money or anything of value. And this actually comes up a little bit more than you would think. And the reason it comes up is that cities are often giving grants and, wanting to do raffles and other sorts of like giveaway events, and those can get a little tricky. So that's where this rule comes in the most. And there is an exception where expenditures for public purposes are not considered gifts, even if a private party incidentally benefits. And that's where it gets a little bit hairy. And so if you think that your board or commission is thinking about doing something like this or setting up some sort of giveaway or a raffle or something like that, definitely do bring that to our attention so that we can run through this analysis, because it is a little bit tricky. So this one is pretty straightforward. You may not solicit campaign funds from agency officers or employees, nor may you condition employment and compensation decisions on political support. Makes sense. Okay, so we're coming to the end here, and this is where I kind of get on my soapbox. Even if something you bring into our attention and we're like, well, it's technically not a conflict, it might be a common law bias issue, and we're still, you're still not entirely sure whether or not you should do it. Do think about the public perception of these things. So even if you're confident about the right thing to do or the technically legal thing to do, it is important that the public believe that the right thing has been done. And it's just really important to make sure that the public trusts the government to do the right thing, because governments rely on the public's trust to get things done. And so if we're cutting corners here or there, or sort of doing things a little bit shady, then it's going to be really hard for the city to effectively govern in the future. If any of these things were interesting to you, or if you have questions about them, of course, come to our office. But if you're looking to do some extra reading, the FPPC has a hotline actually that it can be helpful. They also have a website that I find a little cumbersome, but there's some good stuff on there. Same for the Attorney General. I recommend the League of California Cities, as well as the Institute for Local Government. The Institute for Local Government is great. They have a bunch of one-pagers and resources for public officials covering all topics, both like sort of procedural, sort of like the Brown Act, Public Records Act sort of stuff, as well as substantive. So if you sit on a planning commission and you're not totally sure about something, check out the local government, Institute for Local Government. They've got really, really good stuff. And that's it. You've made it. And again, I'll say it again, please feel free to reach out via email. My email is tburke, B as in boy, U-R-K-E, @bwslaw.com. And I will be happy to answer any of your ethics related or otherwise questions. Thank you.
Now, wasn't that just so interesting and intriguing? Big shout out to Tamar for that. It's a lot of information, and you made it easy to follow, and I love the examples. So thank you for that. At this time, we are going to go ahead and open this up for some live Q&A. So for any of our attendees, if you have a question or a comment, go ahead and engage that hand feature in the bottom of the screen. Also, if you're calling in from a landline or a cell phone, you can press *9. All right, and so Nancy, I'm gonna go ahead and ask you to unmute, and you can feel free to chat with our Assistant City Attorney.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. So my question is around the financial disclosures. Will the city be emailing all of us the form, and by when do we need to do that?
Those are both great questions. I think actually Judy might be able to help us out with if the city is going to email them. And it depends when they're due, depends on when you were sworn in. And again, I think Judy will be able to help us out with that one.
Perfect. Nancy, can you just remind me which body you serve on?
The EQC.
Perfect. So the EQC is not required to complete a Form 700, so you won't have that filing. The city, about a year or two ago, instituted another form similar to the 700 about real property interests, but that only applies to the Housing Commission and I believe the Complete Streets Commission. So at this time, there's no additional forms or filings that the EQC has. If that changes, you'll get that from me.
Can I ask on behalf of everybody else, if they need to file something, do you send that to them or do they need to figure it out themselves?
Yes, great. Thank you for making that more broad. Yeah, so I do request that. If it's a Form 700, I reach out to those folks individually and send them the links to apply online. That way it goes to the city as well as the FPPC. If you're required to complete the city's form, again, that is sent by me, and that is typically done within the first 7 days of being appointed to a advisory body. So
Cool.
yeah, and then again, Sarah and I both track to make sure that we're receiving what we need and we follow up as needed.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you. All right. So again, if anybody has any questions, comments, I'm just going to reiterate kind of the beginning when I had first started this meeting. We're going to be posting this video online for anybody who wasn't able to attend. They'll be able to watch it. As it was mentioned, this is a required annual training for all advisory body members. So for anyone that's in attendance at this moment, congratulations, your annual requirement has been satisfied. And just thank you for spending a Thursday evening with us. We truly appreciate that. And I'll be sending the video link as soon as it is posted online. It'll be on the city's YouTube channel. So we'll do one final call. Going once, twice. See, Tamar, you just did such an amazing job.
Yeah, I was going to say,
already.
I'll take this silence as just excellence in my presentation.
Yes, as you should.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. I was listening and feeling super awkward about listening to my own voice, but I hope it was helpful for all of you.
It was great, definitely. All right, everyone, have an absolutely outstanding, wonderfully beautiful evening. Bye.